Welcome back. Let's get started. Our unit this week is on work and career. So we'll talk about the disciplines of industrial organizational psychology and career psychology or career counseling. I was very pleased with results for quiz 5. So the mean and the median were 73%. So if I can say that half the people felt above or below average, that means the mean and the median are in the same place. The range was 40 to 100%, and I was very happy to see consistent increases in the minimum. So quiz 2 was kind of our first real content quiz, and that had a minimum of 23%, went up to 27%, went up to 30%, now 40%. Okay? And the same people are staying in the class. So I'm very happy to see the bottom of the distribution moving up as well as, say, the average. So good job. Today we'll cover sort of IO and career psychology topics and career theories. So what is a career? I'll talk about the Holland model of vocational interests. It's probably the most extensively used model in vocational psychology. We'll also talk about constructivist career theory, so career as narrative. And we'll also talk about career paths in psychology. This will come up on part 2 of the assignment. So I hope some of this will be useful to you in your self-reflection. So in Appendix A, you got to read about different subfields, different career paths in psychology. Last year, about 50% of students in the class wanted to major in psychology, and about half of those wanted to go into forensic psychology. So I'm wondering what your interests are. Are there any that call out to you? You know, you might want to explore further. Exploring is a stage that comes before deciding, one that follows reflection. Yes. Oh, no. Yes.
I don't think it's out there, but I've been taking evolutionary psychology class for now.
Wow.
So,
What an omission on my part to leave off evolutionary psychology. Marianne Fisher is a brilliant psychologist, and she's done some really interesting work. And in fact, I think she's been misquoted by Jordan Peterson. I'll have to look into that. And she has an active lab, which is also probably one of the nicest physical spaces in terms of labs. Excellent. So we have someone for evolutionary psychology. Does anyone like interest in clinical psychology? Counseling? When people use the word psychologist, they often think of clinical psychologist. It's almost like a psychologist stereotype. You guys know the difference between a clinical psychologist and a counseling psychologist? There's a lot of overlap, but how might you distinguish them? Anyone want to try? Are they the same thing? No, what do you say? Yes. Yes, you got it. So in the first place, when you said disorder, that evokes a medical model, that there are mental illnesses that are kind of like physical diseases, and there's a treatment for the disease, and then the person gets better. And just like you said, counseling psychologists might not, well, they're not really about those labels. They might refer to a clinical psychologist if they thought that that would be indicated, but they're more about helping people adapt and get through transitions and adjust. So there isn't really any, a person's behavior might be seen as maybe a bit maladaptive or distressing, or as adaptive, but not seen as pathological. They work with some different populations too. So clinical psychologists might work in a more hospital setting, counseling psychologists, particularly in educational settings. Now there's educational psychologists and school psychologists. What's the distinction between those? There are people who work in educational psychology here, helping support student success. We can ask, what works better in terms of a way to structure a course, what kind of resources should be offering, what challenges do students deal with. School psychologists tend to work more one-on-one, and one of the biggest differences is the age of the population. So school psychologists work in that K-12 setting. Educational psychology is like a bigger field that I think encompasses school psychology, but educational psychologists might work in university with adult learners. We wouldn't mean that if we're talking about school psychology. What else could be similar there? Community versus environmental. Yes.
Community is about like a broad range of community, whereas environmental is about like how people react to urbanizing, like different environmental studies.
Exactly. There's more of an emphasis on the physical environment, the built environment, and there's also a concern about sustainability. So you might ask, people recycling, how can we get them to do more of that? And then community psychology is more about the socially constructed environment. What about cognitive psychology versus neuropsychology? If you're really interested in the brain as a physical organ and what different structures do and neurons and how they work, might be interested in neuropsychology. But cognitive psychologists do know about neuroscience, and there's definitely overlap between the disciplines, can talk about thoughts without always sort of talking about the brain. So you've heard me talking about connections and a memory trace. No one's ever seen a memory trace. It's like a concept. There are some that we don't talk about much in intro psych that might interest you, like sports psychology, for instance. And there may be some that I'm missing. I'm coming back to community psychology. If that interests you, there's a very highly rated course here in the department in community psychology. It's taught by Todd Leader. So I'd encourage you to look into that if you're interested in community psychology. Psychology is the study of human behavior and mental processes. It's about, it asks what you do and why you do it and what are you thinking and feeling when you do it. And that brings us to a big question, right? What do you want to do? How do you want to spend your life or use those traits that we're measuring? Your cognitive ability, your personality, your social skills. Do any of you have like a clear sense of what you want to do? You're here because you want to, what do you want to do?
I want to be a high school English teacher.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That sounds very fulfilling. And when did you sort of know that? You seem to have a sense of certainty, like that's what I want to do.
I think it was something that like played around with when I was a teenager, but I didn't think that it was something I wanted to accomplish. But I've kind of like circled back to it, and I think teenagers are really cool. They can do anything, so it's cool to be a part of that shaping.
Awesome. And you know what you want to do?
I want to be a criminal psychologist.
Oh, you want to be a forensic psychologist? Well, you are in the right place. We have a forensic psychology graduate program, it's a master's program, and there may be some opportunity for PhDs. I'm not quite sure, but my PhD supervisor is actually a forensic psychologist. So, and do you know what kind of forensic psychology you're interested in? It's a very broad field.
Not moment, but I'm kind of playing around with a few different elements.
Cool. So you could look at victims, you could look at perpetrators, you could look at the system and how well it works and for whom. I think I saw a hand somewhere over here. What about uncertainty? Some people just like not have any clue what you want to do. No clue? Okay. No clue? No clue? More no clues? So this is actually more common. I saw a lot more hands for have no idea what you want to do than knowing what you want to do. And that's fine. And that's very normal. Yes?
I know what I want to do. I want to be a neuroscientist.
Oh, cool.
And I want to work with, I want to be a doctor and work with brain trauma.
Yeah, so the neuroscience to medicine is a pretty common pathway. And I'm trying to think what courses. There's a biological psychology course taught by Jason Ivanoff.
That one last semester.
Oh, neat. And then Dalhousie probably has more offerings because they have a department of psychology and neuroscience. And you can do transfer credits. So you can take a few classes over there and bring them over here. Awesome. So what do most people do? Okay, these are kind of the question, what do you do, can mean a lot of things. And sometimes we answer it in terms of occupation. The word occupation means where are you occupying your time with. And so the most common job in Canada is retail sales associate. And other very common jobs are cashier, food service, administrative assistant. There's some gender difference there. So for men, you see driver, warehouse worker, and construction laborer. So a life has to be so much more than that, though, right? And somebody might bring very different skills to a job as an administrative assistant as someone else and work in different industries. Now, let's say that someone doesn't know what they want to do, and they're wondering, how might you help them? How could you guide them towards maybe not figuring that out, but reflecting on it? What kind of questions might you ask? Yeah, what are you good at? So that is something about skill or ability, which are different words. Skill is more about the proficiency, and ability is the actual doing it. So you could be socially skilled, but you have laryngitis right now and you don't have the ability to speak. I just pulled that out, but that's the distinction between skill and ability. What else could you look at? So you could ask somebody what their skills and abilities are, what they're good at. Yeah. What their interests are. Excellent. So an interest is about an attitude. Different people like doing different things. And an attitude is like a disposition towards something, refers to your values, feeling, and behaviors. And some people might have an interest in taking a car apart and looking at its engine. Other people just aren't interested at all. So that's, yeah, that's a good one. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Things that you don't like doing. In terms of not liking the task, like I do not like tinkering with a car engine. I think that's true because it helps you eliminate certain pathways, and it also reflects or helps guide you to what you are good at. Yes.
Maybe like availability, like in your area, if you're looking to get a job.
Yeah, that is often neglected. So we often assume that people can connect with their interests and their strengths, then they can sort of go do whatever they want. But in reality, things are more constrained than that, and for some demographics more than other. It's a really good one, actually. Often neglected, but very important. Anything else? Yes.
What is like realistically achievable for you?
Yes. Yeah. And that goes with ability and being sort of achievable. Can you afford to go to school to study what you want to do? Those are important questions. There's also values. Some people have a sense that doing a certain thing is really important to them. Let's say you really value children's well-being, so maybe you want to work to promote that somehow. So values, what you think is worthwhile, what's important. And I liked your question here, what don't you like doing? Sometimes it's hard for people to find what their values are. And if you're in that circumstance, you can ask yourself the question, what makes you angry? Because that reflects strongly on your values that have been violated. There's a Japanese model of career that suggests that the sweet spot of what you do is in the center of this model, in some intersection of which you love, what the world needs. So your point about what's available, what you're good at, and then what you can get paid for is important too. Sometimes you can't spend all our time pursuing a passion that you don't get paid for. Maybe that's a hobby, but it's still an important part of who you are and what you do. And so modern career theorists would actually include that hobby in your career, even though you don't get paid for it. I've not looked into the empirical or theoretical soundness of that model. It is in your Feldman and Lavoie textbook, and it is pretty cool. So we're going to talk about work. What do I mean by work? What is work?
What you do for a living?
Yeah, it is something that you do. But you said for a living, but let's say that I'm working on a painting and I'm not going to sell that painting. Can I say that I'm working on the painting? The paintings are okay. So we're going to have to make it broader. Yes. That's very good. So it is labor, and there can be a sense of effortfulness, but what if it was easy? What if I got one of those, there's these awesome student jobs you can get, they're like security and you do your homework and get paid for it. Let's say there's no effort, or it's like really easy for you. Are you still working?
So we say that it's like the action of making like a good or a service.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. So the definition of work, according to Kevin Carter, my sociologist and a professor here in the department, it is purposeful activity directed at producing a valued good or service. It must be valued by someone. Maybe it's you and it's your oil painting. Purposeful, it's not meaningless. And it's directed at producing. And there's some labor. There would be some element of effort there or labor. But that is how you distinguish from labor. What about employment? What's that? Yes.
I guess it's work, but you're being hired by someone.
Exactly. Yeah. So some work is valuable to other people who will pay you to do it. And what about a job? Go for it.
I guess it's like in the short run, you have like a specific job to do or
That's exactly right. So it's much more narrow and defined. And in fact, biopsychologists do something called a job analysis, where they would observe people who were doing a certain job and say, okay, what are the tasks that are doing and how are they doing them? And what knowledge do they need to have? What skills and what abilities? So knowledge refers to an organized body of information. It's usually factual or procedural. If you're a psychologist, you have a knowledge of psychology. If you're a driver, you know the rules of the road. And then there's skills, which refer to the proficient manual, verbal, or mental manipulation of data or things. You have a skill to perform a statistical calculation. You have a skill in turning on your left indicator light. And then the ability is whether you have the power or the capacity to do it or not. We distinguish skills and abilities that way. And then there's room for other characteristics. There might be a job where you say, okay, this person should have an agreeable personality. I'm coming up with something. And then career. What's that? Yes.
Maybe something that you kind of like, lifelong, I guess, like maybe like taking multiple steps to making a career and continuing a career.
You're right on it. There's a sense of a personal journey and a path and something that develops, but it's quite a vague, fuzzy construct. I had these pictures here by Picasso. So he was a painter. And this is this Picasso that you recognize as him later in his life. So it's very symbolic and very abstract. And earlier in his career, so I'm using that word in the sense of this is a journey he was on, he painted more realistic paintings, like the one you see there. I put that, does anyone know what that is? I threw that up there because it says something about the social construction of value. Like if you think, well, who would hire anyone to paint? And that's the Voice of Fire painting by Barnett Newman. It's in the National Gallery of Canada, and it's valued at $40 million. It's 3 stripes, a blue stripe, a red stripe, and a blue stripe. But so let's say that you need some money to pay for your tuition. Can you just go paint 3 stripes? You have $40 million. Why wouldn't that work for you? And maybe it's about who the artist is and the social history of it and what it meant in the history of art. No, but what is worth something, what we get paid to do has a strong element of social construction. And so maybe somebody would look at this and pay millions of dollars for it, and someone would be like, no, no thanks. We've already talked about what interests are. So an attitude characterized by a need or a desire to give selective attention to something that is meaningful to you. Right? And an attitude is a set of emotions, beliefs, behaviors towards something, be it a person, thing, or event. Right? I think an easier way to say it is some people like to do certain things and other people don't. Okay, some people love crafting, they shop at Michael's. Some people hate it, some people don't care. You should probably be doing a job that you're interested in. A Holland model is the most well-established, best researched, best validated measure of career interests that we have. It's not perfect, it does have limitations. It proposes that there are 6 vocational personalities, so it's actually a personality model. And there's the idea that there are these 6 types. And so start with realistic. It's also known as the REASEC model. I'd say that there's some people that like working with their hands, going outside, tinkering with things. The kind of person that would be interested in taking apart a toaster. And you can think of the kind of environments where people with realistic interests might work, and where they can work with their hands. Investigative. So some people have an interest in working with sort of big ideas, scientific research, and intellectual pursuits. And maybe you might find them in a library or a science lab. There's an idea that there's a kind of person and a kind of environment, and we want congruent person, environment, fit. Artistic. So creative people who like imaginative and intuitive pursuits, and maybe that's crafting, maybe that's making music, maybe that's writing stories. There could be a lot of diversity within each of these categories. And then some people like working with people, some people don't, or some people prefer not to. But sort of helping, this would refer to helping professions like teaching and nursing that are about developing people and just interpersonal pursuits in general, caring. And then there's the enterprising type, and that would get at your kind of business, leadership, making money, persuading people kind of interests. And finally, there's the conventional type, and those would be people who like to work in really structured environments. And maybe they like following rules, and they might like organizational pursuits. So administrative assistant would fall under that or be associated with that type. So there have been different factor solutions. Some people say that there's 3 factor solutions, that some people like working with things, that would cover realistic and conventional, but some people like working with ideas, that would cover investigative and artistic, and that some people like working with people, whether it's helping them or leading them, and that would cover social and enterprise. There's also evidence for that some people are interested in everything factor, right? That's picked up when some people just kind of give high scores to all the items that say, would you like to do this and this and the other thing? They're completely different things, some kind of an enthusiasm and an interest factor. This is what the question looks like on the psychometric instrument, and there's a few of them that's associated with the Holland model, and it would ask you something like, so this one would be tapping the social type. So how would you like to help people who have problems with drugs or alcohol? You might just say, no, I don't want to do that. Wouldn't like doing that. You might be kind of neutral about it, or you might really enjoy that. And we predict that somebody of a social type would have higher scores on this item. So other items that you see on that test are assembling items in a factory. How much would you like to do that? That corresponds to the realistic type. Install flooring in houses. Handle bank transactions would correspond to the conventional type. So these items don't ask you what you are good at. They ask you what you like doing. How much would you enjoy it? Doesn't ask you what you're good at, doesn't ask you what you're trained for. So this is a measure of interests. Now, if you go take that test, and I'll ask you to do that for your assignment, it will give you a score for each of those categories. And so this person here got a 0 on realistic, has no interest in taking apart toasters or car engines. And to get somebody's Holland code, you take their top 3 scores. So this person would be social, artistic, and investigative, SAI. Notice how close those two are. It means that it might not matter whether their code is SAI or SIA. Once upon a time, there was something called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles. It was first published in 1938, and it was like a big book of all the jobs. Secretary, what does a secretary do? We'll look it up in the Dictionary of Occupational Titles. And the DOT was created by job analysts who visited thousands of US work sites to observe and record different types of work that people were doing and what was involved. And that's something that industrial organizational psychologists still practice. It'd be something they do before coming up with a job description for a job ad. In the 1990s, it went online as ONET. And ONET describes occupations in terms of the KSOAs required, the education required, how the work is performed, typical work settings. So if you want to know what a certain job does, you can type it in there and look it up. And you can plug in that interest code to see what jobs are held to be congruent with that. So if we put in SAI, it comes up with a list like this. And job zone means how much training you need. So 5, I think, needs an undergraduate degree. No, or maybe 4 is an undergraduate degree and 5 is a graduate degree. I don't recall. But I'm not seeing any 1s or 2s or 3s here. So it's suggesting to me that somebody with an SAI interest code might do well to pursue higher education. But it's having stuff come up like music therapist, a lot of counseling, a lot of teaching. Did any of you have the chance to sort of take this measure or process for a spin? Yeah, I did it?
Yeah, I did.
What did you think?
I thought it was interesting. I definitely got back results that were like relevant to myself as a person. My 4th result was English teacher.
Okay, so it was up there.
Yeah.
And there's different reasons why they're higher or lower on the list. There's 2 reasons. One of them is sorting by job zone. So it'd be lower if it requires more education. That doesn't reflect on whether it's a fit for you. And then they show you your code and then sort of closely related codes. And if your scores were really close, then that distinction might not matter so much. But it sounded like it was pretty reasonable and not completely out to lunch.
Yeah, I thought it was like pretty random.
Yeah. So it's the best model that we have, and the jobs that it picks up tend to be pretty decent. Like it's not, this one's mine, and psychology teacher is on there, but it's not, and I would never be a music therapist or an art therapist, but you can see how it's picking up the kind of psychology theme and the teaching theme. And that's pretty well done. Like, it's not saying I should be a cement mixer or a ballet dancer. So it does have good psychometric properties. And if you go to career counseling, it's quite common that you'll be given a test like that. And most notably, maybe the strong interest inventory, which uses Holland codes. Now I'll talk about some of the limitations of this model. And I do have a quote there that's quite ableist, but it makes a point. The point you made here about accessibility, actually, or availability. So one of the limitations of the Holland model is that it assumes people have a lot of resources or privilege to have the freedom to do what interests you. In reality, when we look at research on people's codes and what they're actually doing and the congruence between their code and what they're doing, people with disabilities are found to be much less likely to be working in a congruent environment. Why might that be? People with disabilities face a lot of exclusion in the labor market, so they often sort of can work and want to work, but the work environments are not structured in a way that they can participate. It would take work in order to set something up that works well for them, and maybe companies don't have the resources to do that. So whatever the reason is, when we did a study on hiring discrimination, and we looked at effects of ethnicity and criminal record, this was the only time an applicant these are fake applicants, was ever rejected because the job wasn't good enough for them. They were all entry-level jobs. It was the only time it ever happened. And in that case, the applicant was white. So this didn't happen with any racialized things. So they said, unless the applicant had a physical disability, they would be a poor fit for the monotony of a male clerk job. What's the assumption there?
People without physical disabilities are too good at the job.
Basically. And maybe somebody could have a physical disability, or let's say somebody is blind, and they are not at all a good fit for the monotony of a male clerk job. There's a bit of an assumption or idea there that they should be happy to get whatever they can. The model does not generalize well outside the United States. That's where its sort of factor structure is best validated. If you go and try and do this in China, it doesn't work as well. Even within the United States, it doesn't generalize well to all minority groups, particularly Asian Americans, and that might be for reasons of values. Like, let's say family could be a factor in what you decide to do. And career counselors find that it might encourage foreclosure. So sometimes students present to career counseling in distress because they don't know the answer and they want the answer. And this test actually kind of provides the answer. And it's probably not the answer. It provides an answer that looks like the answer and maybe sounds like the answer. It might be a pretty decent approximation, but that can encourage people to foreclose, to settle on something when really uncertainty is okay. And maybe they don't need to make a decision and it should be more about exploring and trying different things. So giving people an answer isn't necessarily what you want to do. Any others? I don't know if any of you took the test for a spin and got results that were kind of way out there. Yes.
Provide the link in the schools.
Yes, I put it, I think, in the email, and it's also in the assignment. I decided to put it in the email just in case people, because I knew I was going to be bringing it up in class today. It's pretty outdated. So it came out in the late 1950s. Most of the work was done in the 1970s. John Holland retired in 1980 and didn't write anything after 1999. Has the world of work changed since then? Dramatically. At least for privileged people in that era, you might think that you choose a job and you get a job in an organization, and you climb the career ladder and stay there for your whole life and retire with a golden watch. Things are not like that anymore. It's much more fluid, dynamic work environments where adaptability matters more. You might be working for a job whose title you didn't even understand if you saw it now, or you might be preparing for a job that will be obsolete by the time that you graduate. So we talked a bit about values, and values are the shoulds. You might have some sense that you should do this or you should do that, or somebody is successful because they did that. You might even feel a bit of a pressure to do that yourself. So first, values are about, what you think is good, desirable, or important. And first you get them from your family. Your parents probably taught you certain values. From society, like from school, let's say from any church you might have participated in, from the media. And as you develop, you start to define your own values, and those may be congruent with the ones of your family, or they might not be. Your values are things that resonate with you and make you feel happy. They don't make you feel sort of torn and half-hearted. Sometimes you might have a sense that you should be doing that, maybe feel a bit of an envy towards people who are doing it, but also feel kind of wrong about it. Probably doesn't resonate with your values. Might reflect someone else's values that you've been taught are right, that you're subscribing to, but aren't really your own. The career counselors here at SMU observe that students often fall into a trap of overly focusing on their interests and abilities while neglecting your values. You're not going to be happy in a job or in a workplace culture that doesn't reflect your values or that makes you act against them. So if you value health or health promotion, you're not going to be happy working for a cigarette company. If you value peace, maybe you don't sign up for the army. And those are obvious examples, but organizational culture can be quite subtle. And organizational culture tends to reflect the leader's values. So if you're looking for culture fit in an organization, you want to base that on values alignment. And it can take longer to determine that an organization's culture is or isn't a fit for you. There's, I think, a really well done and interesting YouTube video that I sort of posted on the Just for Interest section of this week's content. And this young lady, Asha, talks about her experience at Harvard. And there's definitely a social script out there that says that going to Harvard is success. But from the things she says, it's pretty clear that she's somebody that really values quality and inclusion. She talks about the exclusive culture, where she wanted to join a club where people go teach kids dance, but there was a big competition to get into it. And everything was really exclusive. And there's these clubs, and some clubs are better than others. And there's just sort of a constant practice of sort of exclusion for the sake of exclusivity. Somebody that had values of prestige might love that, feel really happy there. She found it toxic. So values matter. So how do you know what your values are? Some people just know. They could write down on a list and say, I really value prestige. And then that might mean that you want a job where you can wear a suit and get the corner office and the parking space and be the vice president and be into that. There are lists of career values that you can look at and you pick out the ones that resonate with you. They just kind of feel good and you say yes. And the ones that maybe probably not your values. There's also some values tests. So I'll give you a link to a psychometric test for values. There's also card sort exercises where you have to put things in order and pick what's most important to you. So there's different ways of measuring that. So this brings me to the subdisciplines of IO psychology and career psychology, which are different but related kinds of psychologists. So IO psychologists have a focus on the organizational, and they might ask a question like, what individual is a right fit for the job at this organization? So Let's say you're working for Irving and there's 500 people for this position, which maybe you've defined through a job analysis. Now, how are you going to select the right person for that job? Hoping that they'll stay with the organization, have organizational commitment, that they'll perform well, that they'll get promoted, that they'll be retained. And what's key there is that you're working for the company and for management. IO psychologists are the highest paid kind of psychologists. Seen average is things like $200,000 a year. However, every field has its pros and cons, and it does struggle. I'd say it can be fairly weak on EDI issues and fairly power blind, especially where it works for and reflects the interests of management. Career psychologists focus on an individual client. Using the word employee is a hint that you're working for an organization that has an employment relationship with somebody. So I probably wouldn't use the word employee in a career counseling setting because it's not about the organization anymore, it's about that person. And you might ask, what kind of job is a fit for this person? Or what kind of organization is a fit for this person because of their values and how that aligns with an organization's culture? So you might study how people define themselves, what stories they tell about who they are and how you can go kind of sell that story. You're looking for a job. How people adapt to transitions. So you're not loyal to an organization anymore. You have to realize that people's careers transcend organizations. People might be working in a job for 3 to 5 years and then finding another job somewhere else. Because maybe their contract ran out, maybe the job isn't there anymore, or maybe they got laid off. Now they have to find something different. So the answer is to the individual client, to the person, and it does have, I would say, compared to IO psychology, a much stronger understanding of issues around marginalization. So might be working one-on-one with somebody and talking about the barriers that they experience. And so the field as a whole has a better understanding of it. These are both types of psychologists who tend to work outside the registration process that clinical psychologists go through. So psychologist is like a registered term. And the processes around registering as a psychologist, so becoming a registered psychologist, are very heavily geared to the needs and interests of clinical psychologists. And so other subdisciplines have started moving away from that a bit, okay, especially IO psychologists. And so they might just not ever register. And what does that mean? It would mean that you don't use the term psychologist, they use the term consultant instead. Okay, so psychologist is a legally restricted term. Psychology professors can use it in the context of teaching. So instead you'll hear sort of unrestricted terms like consultant and counselor. Counselor is not a registered term. Neither is therapist, but counseling therapist is in Nova Scotia. Okay. So there's processes, there's hoops that you have to jump through to use the word psychologist, even if you're doing psychology, or to use the term counseling therapist. But you could use the terms counselor and therapist without that. You'll also hear the word coach, particularly with IO psychologists who are working one-on-one, often with executives, so executive coaching. If you're interested in IO psychology, then you're also in the right place. So we have a graduate program in IO psychology here. It's one of the few in the country. Now, I have a question for you. So this young man, his name is Dustin, he has Down syndrome, and he spends his day waving to traffic. And people honk their horns at him. And those folks from his community got together to build him a ramp when he needed one. Is that work? Yes, it is. Why?
It's a service.
Yeah, and it's purposeful and it's valued, and he is providing a service. People like it. Is it a career? It's sort of hard to answer because the word career is such a fuzzy word. So there's no clear operational definition of what a career is. You can see that right here. There's no scientific definition, and that's out of the APA Handbook of IO Psychology, IO Psychology. But we do know that it's something to do with your occupational pursuits over your lifetime, something developmental about it. This is from SARIC, which is the Professional Organization for Education and Research in Career Counseling. This was actually written, I believe, by career professionals here at SMU. And they're getting at a very broad idea of career as a way of being. It's answering questions like, who do I want to be in the world? How can I make an impact? Your skills, your abilities, your experiences, your interests are all ways that you're going to contribute to society, and how do you do that? If you look at definitions of career, there's that sense of direction, almost as if there were a call that you're heading towards. So the word vocational psychology comes from the Latin root for voice, vocare. So there's an idea that there is some meaningful direction, destination, to destiny. The word career comes from, I think, the Latin word for chariot. So there's this idea that it's going somewhere. It's on some path. There's progress along this path, and you're taking it seriously. It's something you care about. You have some sense of commitment, and maybe engage in training and development. So there's an idea that career is lifelong. It's something that's develops. And if career is lifelong, then your careers are happening now. It's not something that starts when you graduate and get your first job. And it isn't just the things you get paid for. So there's a lot of work that you do that isn't something you're paid for. Maybe it's volunteer work that's meaningful to other people. Maybe it's personally meaningful to you. And that's all kind of part of it. Sometimes people look for their passion. In psychology, passion refers to a strong inclination towards an activity or an object or a person that one loves, that you highly value. Maybe an activity that you regularly engage in. And it's something critically that you'll work hard for and sacrifice for. So the root of the word passion is the Latin word for suffering. Can't remember what the word is exactly, but that's where it comes from. And it matters so much to you that you're willing to suffer for it and sacrifice for it. But sometimes people want to find their passion and talk about it like it's a sort of fully grown oak tree in a field. Like walk out and there it is. That's my passion. I'm looking for it and identify it like that. But really, it takes a while and trial and error to find what you love and to discern what matters to you, what your values are, to get good at something. So if we go with that developmental lens of career, maybe it's more about developing a passion. Maybe it's more about finding an acorn. Okay, it starts with some vague interest or inclination. That's your acorn. Maybe you pick it up, looks kind of interesting. You try it out. Maybe you like it. Maybe you don't. If you don't like it, you learn something important from that, just like you said. And then you like it and you practice it. Maybe that little acorn sprouts. You take it a little further, a little deeper, takes root. You water it with practice, with regular engagement. And then one day you sort of have that oak tree that you know is your passion. But you didn't just find it like that. The psychological sense of calling refers to the work that a person perceives as their purpose in life. Okay, something that's unique to the individual, fits with their talents. Somebody loves it or is passionate about it. They might even feel a need or an urgency to do it. If there's anything that you've gotten up at like 2 a.m. to do, or done even when you're tired, or even when the costs to you directly as a person for engaging are high. The meaning of the work is subjective and self-relevant. It's something that's identified by a person, discerned by the person themselves, and not assigned by somebody else. Okay. And it's a part of the personal and professional whole person. So it's a lot more than just a job. And people believe that this work will contribute to a better world. There's an awareness that will somehow serve others. And it follows a process of discernment. It's not something that you know like that. Right? Sometimes people can raise their hand and say, yeah, this is what I'm going to do. But most people for a long time don't know what that is. And that's perfectly okay. Right? So the discovering that path depends on going through processes of introspection, self-reflection, listening to yourself, dialogue with others. Your friends, family, colleagues might know a lot about your strengths, skills, what you're good at. They might have good suggestions. Trying different things and saying yes, or identifying that you don't like doing it. Like listening to yourself. And ultimately, following a calling leads to a sense of fulfillment, higher life and job satisfaction. And if people associate their job with a sense of calling, then we see a lower absenteeism rate. Absenteeism means kind of not showing up for work. Following a calling to some sort of destination or destiny is like a big, lifelong project that could be a bit vague, fuzzy, and in the distance. And the psychological sense of success comes from setting and achieving personally meaningful goals. By personally meaningful, I mean that they resonate with your values. And that's why it's important to set good goals, like the SMART goals that we talked about, not the vapid goals. And then step by step, follow those goals that have up that mountain to that bigger sense of, say, destiny. Calling is a bit of a romantic idea, sort of spiritual, artistic idea, and there's always a place for critical thinking, and this is no exception. So people can feel strongly and deeply called to do something that actually might not be the best idea. I worked on a large project on cyberbullying and suicide, and there were a few cases where the death of the young person was followed by someone in their family. And that was actually really hard work to do. But in one of those cases, I recall, I think the young man's name was Jaden Bell. His father, who was, I mean, obviously losing a child is a terrible thing for a parent to go through. His father wanted to raise awareness for bullying. And so he went on a walk across the country to raise awareness for bullying. And he walked along the highway. So one could certainly understand why a parent would want to do that. You could see the value of raising awareness, but he was struck by a vehicle and killed. So if you had a client with a strong sense of calling to do that, you might be able to work with that person to maybe do something, let's say, in a safer way. So say, well, why do you want to walk along the highway? Is this something that maybe, okay, I'll be seen, more people will know about the cause? Well, are there other ways you could accomplish that? What if every time you safely traveled to a community, you gathered with locals there to, say, walk through a park that's safe, and that's more accessible, and more people would join you? And what if you made your way across America that way? So we can help people that way. I once worked as a consultant for school administrators, and one of the problems that they had was people wanting to go into schools and kind of give an assembly or a workshop to the kids and, let's say, have a class or a program. And this came with really big claims of saving the day, right? This will fix all your problems. This is transformative, kind of anecdotal evidence that this is sort of amazing interventions. And in reality, these interventions overwhelmingly don't work. Okay, they tend to be ineffective. They can even be harmful. So the practice of conflict mediation can be very harmful when there's cases of bullying. So a child, or even an adult that's involved in a mediation that's being bullied, can be harmed by that process. And even if they just don't work, but sort of look or sound good, then they still end up wasting time. So you're diverting time and resources from regular curriculum to do that. And it was very, very hard for officials to say no. They didn't know how to say no. Like, how do you say no to that? It sounds so great, okay? So there's very few programs that have any good evidence of effectiveness. And for really comprehensive evidence-based programs, effects tend to be really small. Okay? But often People might have a sense of calling. I'm going to go into these schools and I'm going to change everything and it'll be great. And okay, so if you think critically and measure your effects, then you might not find that kind of the romance is really in line with the reality. So part of my job was critically reviewing all those sort of amazing transformative programs to give them a way to say no. We can also look at career as a story. Okay, there's a story there about how amazing that intervention can be. We also tell stories about ourselves and who we are and what we do. So imagine if you had to introduce yourself in like one paragraph to say who you are. I had to do that like on the bottom of my syllabus. It makes you go, wow, like what are you going to say? Because let's say that you're 20 years old and it would take you 20 years to describe everything that ever happened to you. Okay, you can't do that. So if you're going to describe yourself in a paragraph or in 5 seconds, then necessarily you have to drop a lot of information and maybe pick up on a few key themes. Okay, you're going to have to highlight and focus on something. So in the constructivist tradition, we're not too concerned with whether a story is sort of really accurately true. There's an understanding that's kind of partly true, partly false. We're going to select some facts and go with a theme. And career counselors in this tradition aren't even really that concerned if something is accurate. Maybe it's symbolic. Okay? And the story belongs to the individual. And the power of the story is, what are you going to do with it? How is it going to inform your next action? What's the next chapter going to be? And people can tell really negative stories about themselves and all the bad things that happen to them and all their failures and all their losses. Maybe that's accurate, but that's not the point. You could still look at all the wealth of experience that they have and choose a better story, a more empowering narrative. That's the sort of the point of the narrative approach. Stories have characters and tropes. The Swiss analytical psychologist Carl Jung hypothesized that the characters that we find in stories follow some basic patterns, and that there's about 12 prototypical characters who have certain goals and certain methods. There's sort of a mother character that wants to take care of people. There's a king character that wants to rule. There are motivational personalities, if you will. And so Carl Jung's collective unconscious, which has these archetypes of personalities, is actually psychodynamic personality theory. Holland Model is also personality theory. Now this one's kind of symbolic and motivational. So if we look at those, let's say 12 different archetypes, the sage on some spiritual journey through knowledge, and you ask like which one applies to career. Well, then career is about leaving your mark on the world, okay, through courage and mastery. That refers to the hero archetype. So the client is to be the hero of their own story. And what is that? Sort of what is a story? What does a narrative look like? So according to Joseph Campbell, who followed in the footsteps of Carl Jung, the hero's journey starts with there's sort of a status quo, the way things were in the world that you know. But then something happened, there was some disruption, something was broken, there was some call, some journey to go out into the great beyond, okay? Somehow the journey starts, and career is a path and a journey. So, okay, let's go along with this. Hearing some call, so you break away and you start following your own path and finding your way through the unknown. Maybe coming to university is a big unknown for you. You don't know what you major in. And it can be overwhelming, and it can be scary, and you can feel lonely. Sometimes there's trials and perils and enemies. And so along your journey, as scared and alone as you might feel, you never really are. You have mentors in your life, right? You have guides, helpers, allies, friends, even since the beginning. And so maybe when you were at your worst and you slipped, there was somebody that carried you through that. Those people are your allies. And then according to this particular trope, it all comes to a climax. There's some crisis, some really big test, some major act of overcoming. You have to fight the big boss, the dragon, the demon. You have to confront some fear and overcome, okay? So you have to confront the dragon head on, and you have to avoid it, okay? So the hero would be the person that, say, battles an addiction and is not consumed by it, but overcomes it. So Jung wrote, strength doesn't come to you in a place of crisis if you haven't first done the inner work. And so all the trials, all the suffering, all the pain made you learn and grow. It's how you discover your skills, right? So walking through all that fire crystallizes and purifies some strength in you. And so it's through your trials and through your suffering that you hone your strengths and discover your gifts and your values. It's how you develop your superpowers and discover your treasures. And the journey kind of changes you. At the end of it, you're not the same. You've developed, there's some transformation. So at the end of this story, according to this model, this trope, the hero returns to the point of origin and bears witness. But kind of you've changed, right? You don't see things the same way that you used to. You see them more clearly. You've come out of the unknown. You've learned a lot. You know things. You've grown up, and you're walking a little taller. So maybe you changed something. Maybe now you see other people with more compassion. So if you overcome your own addiction, you might not see your addicted parents the same way that you once did, maybe with more compassion. And now, so you get to help someone else on their journey. And that refers to Jung's ideas about individuation, right? How you complete your journey as an individual, how you find yourself. You link this to Erickson, who's also a psychodynamic personality theorist. Once you've completed your whole life journey, maybe there's lots of little journeys. Maybe you can imagine that there's a big journey, okay? And you've done that in good faith and addressed all the conflicts. Then you've achieved some kind of integrity of self and found wisdom. Okay. And now you can be the mayor of the Shire and write it all up in the Red Book, West March. So who would be the Jungian hero in The Lord of the Rings? Frodo. Why Frodo?
He's the one that was given the ring in the one.
Interesting. Now this is not a validated theory, so arguing about it is just for fun. Did you have your hand up?
If the quality of the hero is mastery, wouldn't it be Gandalf?
Interesting. I think maybe in a way that they've all sort of learned something and mastered something and had their kind of own journey. Do you know who Tolkien intended to be the hero of the story? So who is somebody whose choices reliably drive the narrative forward? They're sort of honed and transformed in their best self. They come back at the end, bear witness. It's Sam. Again, not a validated model, just for fun. But Tolkien did intend that to be the hero. You could argue that the Jungian hero of Star Wars 456 would be Darth Vader. It's the one that kind of confronts his demons, and he goes through that big overcoming where he picks up the Emperor and throws him down something. And at the end, he comes back to bear witness as his sort of transformed glowy self. When I showed this picture to students in last year's class, almost nobody knew who this was. One military student who was 39. Does anyone here know who that is?
Wesley.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's Wesley Crusher. And so you could argue that the Jungian anti-hero is the Mary Sue character. Maybe I'm sort of out of touch with modern media, but sometimes there's a character that is like the youngest and the smartest person ever to graduate with a PhD in neuroscience at 15. And they're also very skilled in martial arts. and they're very attractive and everybody likes them, and they're just kind of impossibly skilled, and they save the day sort of every day over and over. They have skills that would normally take a lifetime to develop, and they have like 12 of them. And in the story, all the other characters are just tremendously impressed with them all the time, right, with this character. And the sort of character like this can sometimes represent the author's fantasy about themselves, those kind of vainglorious fantasies where you're, I don't know, saving children from fires and are also extremely good looking and everyone's just always in love with you all the time. But in reality, audiences are often kind of these characters. And they haven't gone through any of the kind of sort of suffering process that we would associate with the Jungian hero. They don't make mistakes. They're super perfect. And so in that sense, they might not be real heroes. Suffering and even trauma does have a place in both self-development and career development. Mark Savickas is probably one of the greatest career counseling scholars. He noted that most people's sense of career calling is somehow rooted in personal trauma. Something happened to them, and then they need to fix it, right? And they want to help other people avoid the same fate. And that can be part of a process by which some people heal from a traumatic experience by transcending it. And Jacobus Marie is a career psychologist who specializes in that area. But that said, I don't want to imply that's some kind of a necessary course of action. So if somebody's undergone a traumatic experience, they're not responsible for fixing it. However, people often want to. They might have a really strong drive to, and they might even find some meaning and satisfaction in doing that. So careers are dynamic and non-linear, and they move in unpredictable ways. The idea that it's kind of like a straight path or ladder just doesn't really pan out that way. So it pays to be open to chance and to opportunity, as happenstance learning theory teaches, and to be ready to navigate obstacles and failures and transitions, and even to take advantage of them because they will come up. So what characterizes the most successful, the most resilient species is adaptability, right? Those grasses can grow everywhere, right? The dandelions that outwit your lawnmower, right? The ants that cover the world, they're all very, very adaptable. So there'll be transitions and failures and upsets. You try something that you think will work and it doesn't, that are stressful to get through. And so there are expected transitions and even happy transitions, like let's say the transition to parenthood. That doesn't mean it isn't confusing and stressful. And then there's unexpected transitions, like some people have sudden shocks. Let's say you have a high-flying career and one day you get in a car accident and you can't do that anymore. Now what are you going to do? There can be layoffs, for instance. So transitions can be emotional and stressful. So consider the rituals that we have for going through expected transitions. Things like graduations, weddings, and funerals. Those rituals help people cope. But there's other things that happen to people where there's no ritual for that. So counseling psychologists help people, like you said, adapt and adjust to transitions. And career counselors help people specifically with those work transitions. So imagine if somebody's suddenly laid off and it's 20 years since they've been in school and they thought they'd be doing that for the rest of their life, right? They're struggling with what just happened and their relationship with the organization and what they're going to do next. So how do you successfully navigate challenges and obstacles? It's through a readiness to use your resources and to respond in ways that get you what you want. So this presupposes that you kind of know what you want. You're going to use your resources adaptively. So it's not enough to have a resource. It's not enough to care. It's not enough to have $5,000. You have to do something adaptive, take some adaptive action that actually gets you what you want. Okay, so you have to do something adaptive, something intelligent with your resources. Resilience, that brings me to resilience, which is another one of those popular constructs that you'll hear about a lot. A lot of employers will say that they want to hire resilient employees, or that they value resilience. SMU does that too. Okay? That's from SMU's website. we can't measure resilience at a population level. It's something that's assigned post hoc, after the fact. We predict, we think that because of all these barriers, because of their lack of resources, certain people are going to fail. They're not going to make it. They're not going to make it through that challenge. Okay? Those young addicts on the street are never going to make it. But then sometimes they do make it. Something goes wrong, happily. And those resilient individuals are outliers. They're the error in our model, in our expectations about success, about how the world works. So you have to use qualitative methods and sit down with that young person and sort of say, well, what happened? How did you get through that? Sometimes they're just lucky, right? You can be saved from some difficult situation by luck. But more often, they were somehow able to draw on their resources. Maybe there's some unexpected reserve to respond to that challenge adaptively. And we might not know what people's resources are, what all their skills are. So resilience is at the highest level an outcome of adaptability. We actually can measure that at the population level with psychometrically sound instruments. So you'll often hear employers saying that they want resilient workers, or they promote resilience. Ethically, that leads to the question of what leadership is doing to support adaptability, which is what drives resilience. What resources are they providing to support people? What skills are they training so that people can respond adaptively in the face of challenges? Otherwise, it puts all the onus on the organization members, whoever they are, to take some kind of personal responsibility to overcoming their barriers. So if we're talking about disabling circumstances, resilience is showing successful outcomes in the face of disabling circumstances. Well, that's about environment. So that leads us to ask about social and institutional responsibility towards supporting success, providing resources, training skills. Any questions or comments? No? Okay. So next class, you'll have a guest lecture from Career and Experiential Learning. The syllabus says it's Lisa Appleton, but actually it will be Gail Gaudreau, and she'll be sharing about career and experiential learning, different services that it can offer you. Thank you for your attention.